Welcome back. Well, earlier this year I was interviewing Pauline Hanson, the One Nation leader, talking about climate change, at which point she directed us to talk to her climate change spokesperson, Malcolm Roberts. Well, he's here in the studio now joining me for more. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Tom.
Just want to step through a few things in terms of your beliefs. So you maintain the Earth's not warming from more greenhouse gases from humans, that there's not a warming of the planet as a result of that?
That's correct, and not only that, there's no warming. In Australia, the temperatures in 1880s and 1890s were not only warmer than today, the heat waves are longer and had hotter temperatures.
All right, so I just want to step through the sort of logic of this. You do accept the fact that greenhouse gases trap more heat than nitrogen, oxygen and argon as well, the other elements of the atmosphere.
Carbon dioxide absorbs long-wave radiation, yes, but it doesn't warm the planet.
Well, but it does by nature trap more heat than those other parts of our atmosphere. You agree with that scientific element?
It doesn't trap heat.
It does absorb more heat.
In a bottle, in a sealed laboratory bottle, it traps more heat, but in the open atmosphere, it absorbs heat and then liberates it.
Well, if you don't get any heat at all, though, I mean, if we didn't have any carbon dioxide, according to scientific reports, it would be sort of minus 18 on the planet. So carbon dioxide has an element of making the Earth habitable in terms of heat.
Carbon dioxide has an element of making the Earth habitable in terms of it's essential for all life. That's for sure. But it doesn't cause warming of the Earth.
You don't think carbon dioxide warms the Earth at all?
Well, you see, there are a number of sources. First of all, there are some peer-reviewed scientific papers that say it cools the Earth.
Venus, for example, has a lot more carbon dioxide. It's about 400 degrees. That's an example of a lot more carbon dioxide, and as a result, it's a lot hotter.
And Mars, for example, has 97% carbon dioxide and is cooler than Earth.
So you don't accept carbon dioxide at all?
The Earth
is any contributor to warming?
That's what I was about to say. There are some scientists who say that carbon dioxide warms the planet. There are some scientists who say it cools the planet. The others, and the ModTran simulator is probably the best, it says that up to a certain level, I think about 100 parts per million, which is 0.01%, carbon dioxide is responsible for absorbing some heat and holding it. But above that, it's no effect. So
when you say above that, I mean, you're saying, what, even if it's 100%, there's no difference to heat?
I'm just going by what the ModTran simulator says, and that's had good results. So the other thing, Tom, is that the Earth has often been described by some people as a blanket. It's the complete opposite of a blanket, because what happens is the sunlight hits the Earth's surface, warms the surface, whether that's the ocean or the parks or footpaths or roads, it doesn't matter what it is. The air touches that surface and then raises because it picks up the heat from the surface.
How do you, for example, explain the fact that satellites have measured at the exact level where carbon dioxide is a heating up of the Earth? How do you explain that, for example?
Well, there hasn't been, there's variation. The CSIRO, for example...
No, well, there's no variations on that. That's what satellites are.
No, there is variation. There's variation in everything in nature. I'm not the same height as you, for example.
That doesn't make sense. I'm saying at the level where carbon dioxide is, that's where heating's occurring. There's no variation on that. That's what satellites have measured.
The carbon dioxide levels are greatest near the Earth. It's heavier than air. It's 1.5 times the weight of air. So carbon dioxide is not evenly distributed. It's distributed quite unevenly around the planet. Yeah, for example, there's more carbon dioxide above the Amazon quite often than above heavily industrialised China.
But in terms of that, that's where the satellites are measuring it. That's where the hotter points are.
You've been led astray there somewhere, because we've checked the NASA the satellites that are measuring carbon dioxide, and it's highly variable. It varies from as low as 300 parts per million, which is just 0.03%, to around 500 parts per million in other parts of the world. And it fluctuates on an hourly basis. I've seen the satellite data myself.
You're very focused in your Facebook posts on the relatively low amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So it's about 400 parts per million. And you're saying, how could this small amount make a difference? That's not actually scientific, is it, to just say, well, it's small, it doesn't make a difference?
Couldn't you explain why it's not scientific?
Well, okay, here's one. If you've got a billionth of a gram of radioactive polonium in a cup of tea, that's tiny. How could that kill someone?
Well, here's another one.
Hang on, but it does.
That's correct, because you're looking at a radiation effect. Now, if you look at another effect like arsenic, there's a chemical effect involved. A tiny amount of arsenic can kill you. But when we're looking at a physical effect, a tiny amount of an atmospheric gas, a trace gas, cannot affect it.
But what you just say cannot. That's not based on science.
No, yes, it is. Yes, it is. It is, because the empirical evidence states that the temperature is not increasing. And the other thing is...
That's not true, though. That's not true.
It is.
The empirical evidence doesn't suggest that it's not heating.
The empirical evidence shows that it was warmer, for example, in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. 70% of America's state records...
Let's go through
Hang on, Tom, let me answer your question, please. The 70% of American states' record temperatures were in the 30s and 40s, have not changed.
That's not true either in an annual basis. That's not true. That's not true.
The record temperatures for American states,
that's a record,
70%.
yeah, but you can pluck out individual days and the hottest temperature.
That was in the 30s and 40s.
But most of the hottest years have come. A lot of the states have the hottest years, and I think it's something like 37 states have had their hottest years.
The hottest
since
year
the year
in America.
2000.
The hottest year in America for the whole state, the whole nation of America, 1930s.
The hotter
than today.
37 of the states have their hottest years since the year 2000.
As I just said, there's so much variation in nature, Tom. That nature.
But this is one of your core elements. You don't believe the Bureau of Meteorology when they're saying that Australia is heating up. You don't believe that.
Correct, because the Bureau only shows publicly in its graphs data from 1900 onwards, and that was very cool in 1900 compared with the previous years and the subsequent years.
Pre-1910, a lot of the measurements were so rudimentary they included thermometers in beer crates on outback verandas. You don't seriously expect that to be your so-called empirical evidence?
No, I don't. Well, many of them were done in Stevenson screens, as they are now.
But as I just said, when you're saying let's see all the records from before then, they were too rudimentary, they weren't reliable.
No, they weren't, Tom. Some would have been that way, but some of them were set up by a very well-known, I think it was Rag, I can't remember the guy's name for sure, Rag, who did a phenomenal study around the world of the best ways to measure temperature, and the Bureau of Meteorology's early predecessors had a very good record.
Have you read the peer-reviewed Bureau paper on Acorn Sat2, the adjustment technique they apply?
No, I haven't, but I am aware of people who've criticised that and found glaring mistakes.
You're aware of people that have criticised it. You haven't read it.
No.
Why not?
I can't read everything. Quite frankly, I don't trust the bomb.
You say the Bureau of Meteorology is falsifying information, but you won't read the methodology by which they change data to
We've
make
found
it more
significant
accurate.
errors in that, and we're going to ask Bomb. Stay tuned in Senate estimates.
Well, you haven't read the peer-reviewed paper on their adjustment technique, though.
But I've read other scientists' critiques of it.
Will you read the paper for yourself?
I may do.
Right.
But I have very little faith in Bomb, by the way.
Let me walk you through an example of what the Bureau does. Kerrang, this is recently, in January of 2000, the measuring location was moved from the location in the town centre, that was near the post office, to a more open site in Parkland. Now that resulted in a drop of overnight minimum temperatures, particularly in the cooler months. So what was done on those clear nights in particular, and they did this carefully, and it's shown on their website, an adjustment was made between 0.2 and 1.2 degrees on those nights. Do you understand why they've done that?
Yes.
Is that a fine methodology?
That's fine.
Right.
That's fine. What we need to then do is make sure that that amount was correct, and that's where the question comes in.
And that's what they're doing, and you haven't read how they've adjusted it and by how much by, but you're saying I don't trust
I've read scientists, exceptionally good scientists, critiques of the bomb and found glaring errors.
You say exceptionally good. They've had it peer-reviewed, they've had it internationally peer-reviewed, they've also had the data published raw, they've also allowed the UK Met Office and NASA to look at it as well.
Tom,
they've said it's warming
We've
as well.
cross-examined the CSIRO on this. They presented a paper to us that was peer-reviewed, like many other papers. The one paper on temperature from them by Marcotte, 2013, and Marcotte himself, the author, lead author, said you cannot rely on the temperatures that he's presented in his own paper for the 20th century. What I'm saying, hang on, Tom, you've raised a critical point.
No,
what's happening is that the peer review is no longer adequate. It's not done properly. It's buddy review.
Well, based on what, though? That you pull out one name and you say this is wrong, and you just said to me good scientists.
Yeah, Jennifer Marahasi, Bill Johnston, who worked in the Bureau, completely
Other adjustments that happen occur when large trees grow near a measurement station, if lawn is irrigated, or if it goes from manual to automated measurement. So they're all acceptable.
No problem.
So when you've previously said the bomb's manipulating data or changing it, you accept it needs to be changed. That's the nature of how this science works.
I accept that it needs to be changed in certain circumstances, yes. But one thing the bomb doesn't do, for example, they changed from the large Stevenson screen which was recognised as the best for Australia's conditions, and they changed it to the small Stevenson screen. Now, they did not keep them going in parallel. They have no clue as to what the impact of that was. We know from Spanish papers, peer-reviewed Spanish papers, that when you change to a smaller Stevenson screen, it raises the temperatures recorded. The bomb has artificially inflated the temperatures.
Well, this is your claim. No, I'm not going to hang on, because you're just saying bombers artificially inflated them. You won't even read their peer-reviewed paper on what they're doing. You're just saying the technique is wrong because of something else you've read.
Tom, do you think there is a single politician in this parliament who's read everything that he comes across?
There's not a single politician in this parliament that claims the Bureau of Meteorology is deliberately manipulating data either.
Yes, there are. Yes, there are.
Who else is?
Craig Kelly, George Christensen, and there are others who've got questions about it.
Have any of them read this?
Craig Kelly's done an enormous amount of work on this.
Has he read
Craig
the
Kelly,
Acorn Sat2 paper?
I don't know, you have to ask
Right,
him.
but that's my point. That no politician that is questioning whether the Bureau of Meteorology is accurate enough or in it for some reason needs to necessarily go through every line.
I just told you there are politicians questioning it. George Christensen and Craig Kelly, for example, were very disappointed when Tony Abbott didn't get his way. Tony Abbott also questioned it. Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister at the time, questioned it.
He's questioned the Bureau of Meteorology, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. He tried to instigate an inquiry, and Greg Hunt just had to let them have a cup of tea and bickies, and that was their inquiry. So there are serious questions about the Bureau of Meteorology. They don't stack up. Now, some of their measurements, they have to homogenise. Tom, do you think it's reasonable to have a site 900 kilometres from another site and homogenise relative to that, and that alone? The IPCC's temperature data for the 1850s relies on 1 point for the whole of the Southern Hemisphere. 1 point. That's what we're basing this stuff on?
The IPCC does not rely on 1 point in the whole southern atmosphere.
It did in the 1850s for their Global Historical Climate Network.
This is the point. This is why we're looking at recent data, because that's the reliable stuff that's measured well. You talk about one measurement from 1850.
Okay, let's get to the most reliable measurements of all, and that's a satellite record.
You claimed in 2016 there was a pause in warming on the planet. Since then, we've had 4 of the hottest 5 years in recorded history. Do you have any pause for thought?
Since 1995, there's been no overall trend in
That's
temperatures.
Not true. That's
it
not
is true.
true. That's
it
not
is true. The last 4 years have been warmer than the average.
Since
Tom, you're aware of how averages work?
It's not averages. These are not averages. These are the 4 of the high. These are the 4 of the 5 hottest years on record.
No.
That is what's happened since 2016.
They're not as warm as, for example, the 1930s, and they're not as warm as the 1880s and 1890s.
Well, they are, Senator. They're not warmer than the 1930s. The years are warmer. And this is according to the data.
See, this is what happens. Greenpeace fabricates a claim about the Australian Open being warmer than ever. The 1939
I'm not interested in delving
down
into 1 year from Greenpeace, because that's not the question I'm asking you. And this is the issue with these sorts of debates. You can always pluck out a year when it was hotter.
Exactly.
A day when it was hotter in 1939. No, what I'm saying is I'm not plucking out. What I'm saying is since 2016, you said there was a pause. We weren't heating up anymore. We've had 4 of the 5 hottest years in recorded history since then.
Tom, natural variation.
So you're still putting it down to natural variation?
Entirely. There's no set cause for this attributable to human production of carbon dioxide.
Well, there is, and that they.
Well, where's your evidence? Can you cite to me a single paper, or any scientific agency or any scientist who can prove to us there are 2 things improved? Okay, give it to me.
Meteorology, the NASA.
No, they have never proven carbon dioxide from human activity.
Not according to you.
NASA and the Bureau of Meteorology has never, ever proven that carbon dioxide from human activity affects temperature.
That's
never.
According to you.
Show me the paper. I invite any one of your listeners to show me the paper.
They are out there, and you've been sent them before as well by scientists, by CSIRO, multiple people.
CSIRO, let me get onto that. I've cross-examined the CSIRO,
Let me ask you this, because as I've said, 4 of the 5 of the last years are the hottest in recorded history since you made the statement, we're in a pause. What would it take for you to re-look at this? What if we have another 9 out of the next 10 years that are the hottest in recorded history?
That's hypothetical.
Would you? Well, I'm just asking, at what point would you start to say, gee, this does seem like a trend?
I always go on the real data. Now, the CSIRO that I have cross-examined, I'm the only MP in this Parliament to have cross-examined, has admitted to me, sitting this far apart from the acting head of climate at the time, Steve Rintoul, that temperatures today are not unprecedented. I'll say that again. Temperatures today are not unprecedented. Why do you talk over me when I come up with a fact like that, Tom?
Well,
the CSIRO...
Because what you often do, and reading a lot of your stuff, is you take one part of a sentence out of context, and that's happened before, for example.
Unambiguous. CSIRO has said to me that temperatures today are not unprecedented.
Will you read the peer-reviewed Bureau paper on Acorn Sat2 and their measurements and see for yourself whether you might be convinced that they have the right procedures in
Will
place?
you read my cross-examination of CSIRO? I will happily read the Bureau of Meteorology
Sure.
paper. If you send me the title and the
Sure.
author's name, I'll happily read it.
All right. Malcolm Roberts, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, the South Australian Crossbencher has called for a parliamentary inquiry into the Kangaroo Island bushfires, claiming